So far, we've been using this color picker in the Modify tab to give our objects some color. However, this color picker isn't really the real deal. It's kind of just for quick visualization and perhaps for choosing a color you'll be okay with staring at for a few hours while you model, but it has nothing to do with Max's actual material system. Now, in 3D, when we say material, we're referring to the properties of a surface, its reflectiveness, transparency, the textures or colors it's using, whether or not it's glowing, for instance. To bring up the Max Material Editor, we simply press M on the keyboard. Now, if your material editor looks like this, go ahead and change it with me to the Compact Material Editor. We simply do that by clicking on Modes in the top left corner here and clicking on Compact Material Editor. The Slate Material Editor, or node-based material editor, as it's more commonly called, definitely has some cool features, but the compact one is the one I'm used to and the one I use all the time. So you'll notice these balls we have here. Now each ball represents a material. So we can apply these materials to our objects by simply dragging them onto our objects. We can also select an object and then select a material ball and then click Assign Material to Selection. That will also do it. So you'll notice we have an extremely confusing dialog here, but it's really not that bad. So here we have our shader type. We have these different ones here, and they all look a little bit different. You guys can try them all out if you wish. However, I rarely ever use them because 90% of the time I'm authoring for a game engine, and game engines typically have their own material systems. And if I am software rendering, I'm usually not using the default rendering engine for Max, and different rendering engines usually have kind of their own materials also. So moving on, these color swatches here, this ambient one I recommend you never ever touch. The ambient that Max does died a long time ago with the dinosaurs, and now we use much nicer looking methods of getting ambient light. This ambient will basically like hit your model uniformly with a certain color, which will look pretty awful. Ambient is off by default though, so you don't even need to worry about that color swatch. Then we have our diffuse, which we can just define a color. Now diffuse is often a synonym for color. So if you hear the word diffuse map, it kind of means color map. We have wire here, which will simply make our geometry a wireframe. We have two-sided, which will make it so that our faces render from both sides, because by default, if we look at a polygon from its backside, it'll just kind of be invisible. Faceted will ignore the smoothing groups for our model. However, you won't be able to see it in the viewport. It'll only happen at render time. And face map, quite frankly, I have no idea what it does. We have self-illumination, which kind of makes our material glow a little bit, and opacity, which will make our material transparent as we lower. Then we have a few parameters here concerning our specular highlights. Now, if you're not aware what specular is, it is essentially a reflection, particularly the reflection of a light source. So when you look into someone's eyes and you see that white little glistening dot on their pupil, that would be a specular highlight. This specular level basically controls how bright we want that highlight to be, and this glossiness controls how tight we want the highlight to be. So if we have a very bright specular level with a very high glossiness, we'll have, as you can see indicated on our material ball, a very tight little white dot. If we have a low specular level and a low glossiness, we'll get big, large specular highlights. So this would be something like clay would have a very low specular level and low glossiness, something very matte. And then something very shiny, like an eyeball, would have a high specular and gloss. Not quite sure what soften does, to be honest. If you're making stuff for a game engine, when you export this, these properties won't come in generally. And if they do, then they'll be into a completely different system, so you'll have to tweak them all over again anyway. Then we have the extended parameters, which I never use. We have super sampling, which I also never use, and then we have maps, which is probably the real meat of the material here. We have all these different slots you see, and all these slots are places that we can input stuff. 99% of the time we're going to be inputting images here. images that we make in a 2D application like Photoshop. For instance, we're going to have a diffuse map or texture that we plug into this slot here, and then the color of our mesh will be defined. We have a slot for specular level. So a lot of these slots will simply take a black and white image, and the value of each pixel will actually define the power of the particular slot it's plugged into. For instance, in the case of specular level, white would be full specular, whatever you've put in your parameters, and black would be no specular at all. But we can also plug in all kinds of things we want into here. For instance, if we click on diffuse color, we get all of these different things that we can plug in, and most of them here are like procedurally generated stuff. But the one we're going to be using 90% of the time is bitmap, which is a real fancy way of saying image. We're going to learn about this stuff in depth later, and it'll all become a lot more clear once we learn about UV mapping. For this pan though, since this is just a very basic overview of materials and rendering, we're not going to make any custom textures. We're only going to use procedural textures and no UV maps to make things very simple. So I don't know about you, but I don't want my pan to be lime green. Psh, why'd you guys make it lime green? Weirdos. And maybe almost black. We never want to go completely black, because if we do that, then we won't have any room to shade. So like there'll be no difference between like a spot that's just getting a medium amount of lighting and a spot that's getting no lighting at all. So we always want to leave a little. And let's change our shader type to metal perhaps. And let's make this puppy nice and shiny. Not that shiny though. And it's kind of useless to look at what it looks like in the viewport, because it'll all look different by the time we render it. And we haven't gotten to rendering yet. So let's give this guy our very first test render.